first of all, my turn to thank Bertrand and Emily so much for giving me the opportunity, and in a way also a bit of the responsibility of inaugurating this workshop, because I'm the one.
You're not alone.
I'm in a room full of friendly people, I was assured. So here I go. My name is Francesca Genesio. I'm currently finishing my doctoral thesis on Mazzei as a citizen of the world. And what I'm giving you here is a little snapshot or a little insight into a part of the work that I've been conducting now for several years, and I hope to be able to finish shortly and discuss my thesis early in 2022. So my presentation today is entitled Representing the Early Republics Abroad, Mazzei's Ambassadorship to Europe Between Parallel Diplomacy and Propaganda. And just as by way of introduction, well, both to Mazzei and a little bit perhaps to myself as well, Mazzei and I share a couple of things, including nationality, because he was Italian and so am I. Mazzei lived in different places throughout his life, including London, the United States, well, Virginia, and France, and me too, except the United States. I never lived there. I visited several times. But otherwise, we followed kind of a similar geography. So that creates a little bit of a bond that has united us over the past couple of years that it has taken me to conduct this study. Anyway, to get to the more important things. Mazzei's story, this is a bit of an anticlimax, but unfortunately it's true. It is largely one of high hopes and unfulfilled aspirations. Viewed retrospectively, his greatest contribution to the American revolutionary cause, somewhat frustratingly, appears to have been one of dedicated propaganda, often involving both literal and figurative translations or reinterpretations of American events for European audiences, whom, as he believed, had been misled in their visions of America by inaccurate renditions of the nation's revolutionary memory, to refer to the title of this seminar. So born in 1730 in Poggio a Caiano, which is actually a small village some 20 kilometers northwest of Florence, Mazzei, whom casual observers often and somewhat inaccurately compare to an Italian version of a Thomas Paine, moved from London, where he had resided since 1756, to Virginia in 1773. And his intention was that of setting up a business and introducing the cultivation of Tuscan crops, such as grapevines and olives, into the colony. Now, upon frequenting the local political elites, however, Mazzei's enthusiasm for agriculture quickly gave way to an even greater enthusiasm for American politics and for the American revolutionary cause, which resonated deeply with his own beliefs in freedom and equality that he had nurtured since early youth. So the American cause he embraced wholeheartedly, attempting to be of use to his adoptive country as best he could for the better part of his mature life. More than anything else, Mazzei hoped that he could one day occupy a diplomatic position, using his linguistic, cultural, and networking skills to mediate between American and European interests on behalf of the young republic. Jefferson, who was his close friend, demonstrated awareness of his abilities early on, and in 1778 recommended the Florentine to John Hancock in a letter in which he enthusiastically proposed that Mazzei be sent to Europe as an undercover agent to negotiate a loan from either the Grand Duchy of Tuscany or the Republic of Genoa on account of Congress. And I quote from Jefferson's letter, "One of the gentlemen of whom I spoke above, Mr. Mazzei, is, I think, more likely to negotiate this matter to our advantage than perhaps a native alone." And he continued, "He possesses first-rate ability, is pretty well acquainted with European courts, and particularly those above mentioned, is a native of Tuscany with good connections, and I have certain proofs of the Grand Duke's personal regard for him. He has been a zealous Whig from the beginning, and I think may be relied on perfectly in point of integrity. He is very sanguine in his expectations of the services he could render us on this occasion, and would undertake it on a very modest appointment. So much to the Florentines' regret, however, the official appointment on behalf of Congress that he so desired never came, neither then nor later. And he kept looking for it. He kept asking for that appointment, but it never came. And this was actually the first and last time that Jefferson recommended him for such a position. The closest he ever got to his goal was an incursion into what could be called parallel diplomacy under not congressional, but Virginian sponsorship during the War of Independence. Naturalized a Virginian in 1774, Mazzei was sent to Europe in 1779 to negotiate, again I quote, a loan of gold and silver to the Commonwealth of Virginia for the purpose of reducing the quantity of paper circulation and for carrying on the war against Great Britain. His principal targets remained the Grand Duchy of Tuscany and the Republic of Genoa, where he hoped he could find both money and support. And the commission, which was signed by then Governor Patrick Henry, was seconded by another document granting Mazzei authority as the state's commercial agent in Europe, with a mandate to establish trading relations between Virginia and those European countries whose support he would manage to secure. Mazzei's mission was a failure. Once in Europe, he quickly realized that his diplomatic credentials did not have the official status he had hoped for. Franklin, who had been representing the new nation in Paris since 1776, and who was then acting as minister plenipotentiary, met the news of Mazzei's Virginian appointment with cold hostility, fearing that individual states' diplomatic initiatives would lead to a fragmentation of the United States bargaining powers in Europe, and complaining, as Mazzei summarized to Jefferson in a letter dated April 1780, that, I quote, "So many people had come to Europe from every state on this kind of business that they have ruined our credit and made the money men shy of us." Franklin's refusal to second Mazzei's mission in Europe was not his only problem. Having been captured at sea by British privateers upon setting sail from Yorktown in the summer of 1779, Mazzei had thrown all of his official papers overboard to conceal the true nature of his journey. Despite sending multiple letters to Virginia asking for a copy of his credentials, these only reached him in August 1781, only months before he was formally recalled in January 1782. Now, that date, January 1782, corresponds to the date in which the letter of recall was written and sent, but he only received it actually in the following summer because, of course, communication was not easy. So while transatlantic communication was extremely difficult and uncertain at the time, Mazzei had actually begun suspecting Franklin of willfully retaining his correspondence in order to thwart his unilateral diplomatic endeavors. Now, Margherita Marchione, who's one of the most established scholars of Mazzei and spent a large part of her career collecting and editing Mazzei's writings and correspondence, well, she advances that Mazzei's credentials may, in fact, have been retained not by Franklin, but by Bancroft, who was Franklin's secretary, who also revealed himself to be a British spy. But the matter was enough to ruin the relations between Mazzei and Franklin for good. So irrespective of the unlucky circumstances of the loss of his papers, historians have noted that it is unlikely that Mazzei's mission could have succeeded anyway. Peter Leopold, who was the Grand Duke of Tuscany, was an Anglophile, or actually, as Mazzei later explained to King Stanislaus Augustus Poniatowski, he was more of an, I quote, ineffable Gallophobe, and remained hermetic to Mazzei's relentless lobbying and insistent letters, of which there were 11 in total. In Genoa, the likelihood of his obtaining a loan was just as slight, owing to the stringent, below market rate negotiation margins that Virginia's mandate allowed for. Prior to Mazzei's arrival, Franklin had already tried raising money in Genoa on behalf of Congress this time at an interest rate of 6% and failed. And Mazzei's Virginian Commission only allowed him to offer 5%. So the Florentine complained about this situation several times in his letters, explaining that investors in Genoa had recently made important capital placements both in France and in England, I quote, tempted by the advantageous annuities of France and the high interest given by the other. Implicit in this statement was the idea that money could indeed be found if only the borrowers would show themselves willing to pay the adequate interest for it. He also emphasized the unhealthy competition existing between Congress and the individual states in securing loans, somewhat impudently, again, building a case for a conversion of his Virginian mandate into a national one by stating that investors in Genoa would be more inclined to negotiate with an Italian-speaking congressional agent than with either the Italian representative of a single state, as he was, or with English-speaking congressional diplomats who lacked the knowledge both of the Italian language and of its culture. Needless to say, once again, this attempt came to no avail. So, stranded in Europe, with no official mandate, no news from Virginia, and no support, all the Florentine could do was to endeavor to be of service otherwise. Unable to represent or stand for his adopted country diplomatically, Mazzei unilaterally undertook to represent it ideologically, using his growing network and writing skills to paint and promote positive images of America's struggle for independence in Europe. In other words, Mazzei's abortive incursion into parallel diplomacy turned into an arguably more successful, self-commissioned ambassadorship of interpretative propaganda. Mazzei wrote several propagandistic essays and short pamphlets while in Europe between 1779 and 1783. His troublesome time as an agent of Virginia, however, was not the first occasion he had seized to support and to build support for the American cause. And it wouldn't be his last. His first stay in Virginia between 1773 and 1779 had coincided with the build-up to the war. Caught up in the revolutionary fervor of his immediate environment, which included figures like Jefferson, but also Madison, Washington, Mason, Page, Henry, Bannister, Blair, and the Randolphs, among others, Mazzei had contributed numerous essays, letters, and newspaper articles promoting American independence and expressing his criticism and disavowal of everything British, from claims to sovereignty over the colonies to affirmations of the superiority of their constitution. Mazzei's propaganda during this first phase of the war looked both inwards and outwards, trying to mobilize support for the cause both domestically and abroad. In words, this time very similar to Thomas Paine's, but as early as 1774, he had emphasized the need to make revolutionary principles intelligible to the common man, claiming, I quote, "Practitioners of fine writing will forgive me. They need no one to write for them. I write for people who, endowed with good common sense, did not acquire book learning," end of quote. Similar articles and letters, along with translations of official documents such as the Declaration of Independence, were written for foreign audiences, mostly Italian at first, and sent to popular newspapers like Notizie del Mondo and Gazzetta Universale for publication. These are Tuscan gazettes because, of course, he was a Tuscan. It wasn't until the late 1780s, however, that Mazzei's engagement as a propagandist reached its full maturity. Having returned to Europe under unclear circumstances in 1785, after a short stay back in Virginia, Mazzei found himself in Paris, largely out of money, which was the case for most of his life, almost begging for a diplomatic posting, which would have taken care of the previous problem, and spending his time among the liberal intellectuals and aristocrats of the time, first among whom were once again Jefferson, but also Lafayette, Condorcet, La Rochefoucauld, the two dudes, and Dupont de Nemours. This third phase of propaganda corresponds with the writing of his Recherches historiques et politiques sur les États-Unis d'Amérique septentrionale, which he undertook between 1785 and 1788 upon realizing that Europeans only had a superficial understanding of American society and institutions and were being presented with what he considered to be an erroneous account both of the revolution and of the nation's colonial history. The Recherches were originally written in Italian, but they were then translated into French by Louis-Joseph Faure, with occasional contributions by the Condorcet, and they were published in 1788. Unfortunately, the Italian manuscript is gone. It's no longer to be found, so it has to be read in French today. It had originally started as a minor project aimed at rejecting Mably's interpretation of recent American history and politics in his Observations sur le gouvernement et les lois des États-Unis d'Amérique. The refutation had been the subject of a shorter satirical paper, which in his Memorie, Mazzei recalls having written to amuse his friends. Referring to Mably's observations, quite irreverently, he writes, I quote, although I despised his monograph, I bought it to please Short, which would be William Short, who wished for me to confute it. But when I read it, I thought it didn't deserve such consideration. So I determined to write down a few observations in a style that would amuse my friends. I wrote a dozen or so and read them to Marmontel, who was amused. But he said that the work required serious confutation because the abbot was reputed trustworthy. Of this, I had trouble persuading myself. Encouraged by Morellet and by other members of his entourage, including Jefferson, Mazzei set out to write a more formal refutation of Mably's work, extending his project to include a rebuttal of what Raynal had written about North America in his Histoire des Deux Indes. Mazzei did not think of Mably and Raynal in the same way, but considered them both very dangerous in terms of their opinion-shaping capacities in Europe. To Mazzei, Raynal was, I quote, a willful liar, untrue and partial, while Mably was dismissed as good-natured and uninformed. In a letter to John Adams, dated October 29, 1785, he specified, the first is an Anglo-man, and the second has written for the mere sake of writing, probably in his dotage, without knowing what it was about. While Mazzei claimed that national honor had been his first motivation in undertaking, I quote, the confutation of the mistakes, follies, indiscretions, and falsities of certain writers, and that he was writing as a historian, however, it is quite clear that what the adoptive Virginian was defending in his recherche was a specific reinterpretation of the American revolutionary narrative, influenced by his own beliefs and very much in line with the political identity of the Americanophile and later Americanist circles that he associated with in Paris. Paraphrasing Joyce Appleby, one could define the Americanist group as a group of French progressives who instrumentalized what they perceived as the American example to serve as an alternative to the English model in the context of the late 1780s debate on how to reform institutions in France. As far as Mazzei is concerned, this leads us to make several observations. Beyond being staunchly pro-American, Mazzei, like Condorcet, La Rochefoucauld, and the others, was profoundly anti-British. Disappointment with the British Constitution, which promised liberty, but fell short of delivering on its expectations, had grown on Mazzei since his London years, before he moved to Virginia. The Wilkes incident in 1769 had appeared to him as the final confirmation of the inadequacy of a system which could tyrannically dismiss a popularly elected representative, effectively denying constituents their fundamental rights to sovereign suffrage. The contents of his recherche reflected such positions. While it is doubtful that he was a genuine theoretician, Mazzei was nonetheless a skillful writer, benefiting from the support of a network of abler and more prominent individuals who assisted him in his endeavor, providing him with ample political and historical material to be used in his demonstration. Jefferson, for example, who had invested significant time and effort in attempting to correct de Meunier's entry on North America in the Encyclopédie Méthodique, and who had originally intended to refute Raynal himself, made all his notes available to Mazzei, consistently offering advice and guidance, as did the Condorcet and his other friends. It is therefore unsurprising that Mazzei's recherches are not very original in terms of their content. In addition to the two books dedicated to the confutation of Mably and Raynal, Mazzei produced two other volumes that are still part of the recherche, respectively retracing the history of the American colonies and institutions up to the Revolution, and discussing a selection of prominent issues relative to contemporary American society. Behind Mazzei's words and choice of subjects, one can perceive a chorus of Americanophile voices, both American and French, generally faithful to the spirit of 1776, favorable to the establishment of free trade, opposing the format of the new constitution of 1787, and rejecting the Montesquieuian or even Polybian trope of checks and balances as a model for liberty and constitutional reform. Mazzei's interpretation of the American Revolution borrows from previous writings by Jefferson and Franklin, as Edoardo Tortarolo points out in his extensive work on Mazzei. His final manuscript includes several references to Paine and to Turgot, and when I say references, I actually mean long passages of their work that are quoted, as well as 4 essays by Condorcet in support of unicameralism, and also part of Condorcet's work on slavery, or condemnation of slavery. Now, going back to Condorcet's 4 essays in support of unicameralism, Mazzei eulogizes them in a letter to Madison, where he writes, I quote, "I had forgotten to tell you that at the end of my book, you will see 4 well-reasoned letters of the Marquis de Condorcet, which he sent me, in which he mathematically upholds a unicameral legislature. I too am of the opinion that it may be retained and put on such a footing as to remove perhaps altogether the dangers feared." The dangers which Mazzei feared were the division of society into different bodies, leading to the emergence of a privileged aristocracy in America, as was the case in Britain. These were dangers that Madison didn't share, having supported bicameralism and having displayed a more hierarchical vision of society from the very beginning. Upon reading Mazzei's Recherche, John Adams, who knew Mazzei personally as well, reacted indignantly to Condorcet's 4 letters, immediately interpreting them as a way for the French philosopher and mathematician to get back at him for his refutation of Turgot in a defense of the constitutions of government of the United States of America. On an intertitle page preceding the first of Condorcet's letters in Adams' copy of the Recherche, Adams expressed his frustration in his own handwriting by writing, the following 4 letters were written by the Marquis de Condorcet, a man of science but little acquainted with history, ignorant, totally ignorant of all writings on the science of government, with very little knowledge of the human heart and still less of the world. The letters themselves are a demonstration of all of this. They're plainly written as an answer to my defense, but it is plain that he had not read it. His enthusiasm for Turgot provoked him to write an answer to my book without reading it. It should be recollected that he has written a life of Turgot, and that life is a historical panegyric. Adams' irritated reaction to the publication of Condorcet's 4 letters in Mazzei's book illustrates the extent to which the Florentines' work and ideology were ingrained in the debate that opposed Turgotists and Montesquieuists, or Americanists, again, Jefferson, Condorcet, Dupont de Nemours, and Anglomans on the other side, people like Delolme, Adams, and Renan. Seen in this light, the Recherche appear as less of a testimony of intellectual originality and historical accuracy than as a contributive platform for organized propaganda, a tool for expressing collectively concerted political opinion in a discussion that was no longer uniquely about America, but also increasingly about France. In other words, in the Recherche, the experience of the American Revolution was being edited and translated in the way that could also serve the cause of late 1780s French progressive reformists. Both Antonello Gerbi and Manuel Albertone have evocatively referred to Mazzei's Recherche as a war machine, una macchina da guerra in Italian, with Gerbi specifying, I quote, in short, the whole Americanophile coterie joins the work as if collaborating on the construction of some massive weapon of war. The group that Mazzei frequented while writing his Recherche was largely the same one he joined in the creation of the Society of 1789 in Paris, testifying to his participative interest in French revolutionary events. Similarly, following the publication of the Recherche, Mazzei cooperated with Condorcet, Dupont de Nemours, and Gallois to publish a heavily annotated French translation of John Stevens' Observations on Government, including some animate versions on Mr. Adams' defense of the constitutions of government of the United States of America and on Mr. Delolme's Constitution of England by a farmer of New Jersey. And this was in 1789 that the translation appeared, the French translation. While the title of the pamphlet still focused on America because its original author was indeed American, The French edition of John Stevens' work, modified as it was by the extensive footnotes that the members of the French editorial team had added, was clearly aimed at promoting unicameralist reform in France, taking the ideological slant behind the Recherche one big step further. Mazzei's ambassadorship of propaganda had visibly transitioned into a new phase. Beyond wishing to correct erroneous perceptions of the American experiment abroad, Mazzei was now endeavoring to recreate and export a specific and in many ways contestable version of the revolution's institutional testament to politically effervescent France. In doing so, he was departing from American realities of the late 1780s. Having idealized the democratic spirit of 1776, Mazzei had grown out of touch with the events and debates that had led to the drafting of the Constitution of 1787. This he found lacking in many ways, fearing an exaggerated concentration of powers and a return to British-inspired bicameralism. How could you assent to various articles of the proposed Constitution which prepare lethal lightnings for poor liberty, the Florentine wrote to Madison from Paris on February 4th, 1788, adding, I hope you're not infected with the malady, alas, epidemic of balance and counterpoise in government matters. Nay, he concluded, your chimerical balance is no balance at all. Madison's answer to Mazzei, penned in New York on October 1788, expresses annoyance at the Florentines' insinuations. And now I quote Madison quite extensively, but I think it's interesting. You asked me why I agreed to the Constitution proposed by the Convention of Philadelphia. I answer, because I thought it safe to the liberties of the people and the best that could be obtained from the jarring interests of the states and the miscellaneous opinions of politicians. And because experience has proved that the real danger to America and to liberty lies in the defect of energy and stability in the present establishments of the United States. Had you been a member of the Assembly and been impressed with the truths which your situation discloses, you would have concurred in the necessity which was felt by the other members. In your closet in Paris, and with the evils resulting from too much government all over Europe fully in your view, it is natural for you to run into criticisms dictated by an extreme on that side. Perhaps in your situation, I should think and feel as you do. In mine, I'm sure you would think and feel as I do. Madison was implying that Mazzei had been absent from America for too long and that changes in revolutionary realities were escaping him. Are we ever to see you again in America? He asked at the very end of this letter, just before closing, here or elsewhere, God bless you. From the standpoint of Madison's domestic experience of the American Revolution and its aftermath, Mazzei had become too radical. From Mazzei's point of view, the spirit of 1776 had been betrayed, and the Constitution of 1787 appeared as something of a counter-revolution. America, which an overzealous and infatuated Mazzei had almost come to perceive as a hopeful personification of Lady Liberty, had partly reneged herself, leading the Florentine to seek ideological comfort on other revolutionary shores, where he hoped the spirit of the original American struggle could be transplanted and revived in all its reasoned but enlightened moderation. If a handover there ever was, whether actual or attempted, between the American and French revolutionary spaces at decade's end in the 1780s, which is a claim that is itself disputable and has indeed been disputed many times, then Mazzei was one of the movement's dispatch riders, both physically and ideologically traveling on the crest of overlapping avant-gardist waves, trying hard to avoid having to publicly acknowledge their troughs. As such, the reverberation of the American revolutionary movement that Mazzei contributively attempted to carry over into France, albeit imperfectly given the circumstances, was in the late 1780s but an echo of the American events that had already passed, but which Mazzei must have hoped could still be useful in inspiring future reform, their ideological guiding light being comparable to that of a star whose physical existence is no longer certain when earthly observers use it to navigate their vessels.
Okay, thank you so much, Francesca. And I think, as I was telling you, can you hear me? No. As I was saying, you fit perfectly into this program because being Italian, working on Italian, but being trained in France and using a multiplicity of sources in various languages. So it's wonderful to have you with us and to hear your talk. I think for once, maybe that's possibly the first time ever that we are early at a conference, at least in France. So we have time for
questions.
Questions. Yeah.
Of course, it was planned, actually.
Ah, sorry. You know,
we're not early at all.
Remember what I said at the beginning. You know, I think that things are, come by magic, but no, Emily's done them, or planned them. Okay, so you have a perfect example here. So let's open the floor for questions. The only thing I'll say before we start is, I know they were on different sides with Crèvecoeur, but he's wandering around, is looking for a diplomatic position, is writing about the US and using it as self-promotion. I think, we know he was a loyalist before he defended the revolution, but still, they look alike to me, in their profile.
Yes, which computer am I speaking of? No, this one here. Yes, well, to me, the way I've come to think of Mazzei was as the embodiment of a modern man, ultimately, somebody who invested the scene of these changes with all the hopes of modernity, because he wasn't particularly well born, contrary to Crèvecoeur, but Mazzei, no, he was just issued from a family that had owned land in Tuscany, but was by no means noble or anything of the sort. And he made his way through life trying to work himself up the social ladder. And in many ways he managed, although I started off saying that it was a failure. So maybe the failure was because his expectations were set very high. But at the same time, he did manage to make his way, meet all these great people that, nothing at birth had disposed him to meet, and actually leave his imprint, if modest. And well, that's maybe why also I'm here trying to make it a bit less modest, because I think he did leave an imprint that was worthwhile. And not just me, and all the people, of course, before me. And I see Eduardo Tortarol is there. And of course, he's the most qualified person really to talk about Mazzei, having studied him extensively. But I think he really embodies this spirit of modernity that in many ways characterizes the period that we're studying. And I like him because of that, I think.
Thank you. But at least we talk about him, 300 years afterwards.
Exactly. We're still talking about him.
Gerard?
Another question. We've talked so much about Mazzei for now 4 years.
A bit more.
Just when I was listening to you at the end of your talk, about the relationship between Madison and Mazzei. I don't know who lied to the other, but these two people certainly are not on the same wavelength from the start. And I don't understand how Mazzei could be confused, could be mistaken by what he thought Madison's deep feelings were about the revolution itself and about what was going to be done in Philadelphia, because the compromise in Philadelphia doesn't go as far as Madison would have wished. It is below. Madison had in mind a consolidated, unique government with one sovereignty and the virtual disappearance of all states. So we are very far from the spirit of 1776. So you see.
Yes, I think.
Can you repeat the question or summarize the question for the online? Did you hear the question online?
From home? No, maybe.
It's a question on.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect.
Not
Well,
really well.
It's a question on Madison and Mazzei, their relationship. And Gérard Hugues was asking if who lied to who, basically, and how they could get along with visions, so different visions of the American Revolution and what should result in.
I think the answer to that question, if an answer there is, but was the fact that
I don't think there's an answer.
yeah, I don't think there's an answer either, but maybe I can try to say a few things to defend my friend from Tuscany. No, I think that if there's an answer to that, or what I could say relative to that, is that ultimately Mazzei didn't spend much time in America after all, because he was there from 1773 to 1779, and then left, and then came back briefly in 1784 to 1785, and then left again. And so his only experience of America was really revolutionary. And so that's the memory that he was left with. And during the revolutionary period, in revolutionary times, everybody comes together to promote one single cause, which in the case was the cause of American independence. But he was not there for the Reconstruction part and for the kind of part that supposed putting together of ideas. Although he did write, he did express his constitutional ideas while he was in Virginia, but that's a subject of another paper, maybe at another point. But I think he left America with this idea of of revolutionary America, and he thought that it was going to continue that way, and that was what motivated everybody in America. But in fact, what he didn't realize, that was even prior to the revolution, well, America was not a classless society. It was very much divided into different social classes, maybe not as much as in England, but those differences and the differences in the body politic, which he didn't like, did exist. And so he had idealized the whole thing from the start. And I think more than that, and it's what I'm going to hopefully try and argue in my thesis as well, is that Mazzei came to America with a set of ideas and beliefs that belonged to him already. And he thought he found the expression of those beliefs in the American Revolution. But in fact, he was projecting his own beliefs onto the American Revolution. And when the American Revolution swayed the other way, he actually couldn't understand how that was possible. But in fact, he was in love with his own ideas and hoped that the American Revolution would carry out this vision, which wasn't his. And so when he realized that, well, he said, maybe we can try France, but that turned out even worse. And so he remained a bit frustrated and ended up retiring back in Pisa and tending to his garden.
There is a question in the chat from Eduardo Tortarolo. Maybe I'll let you read it.
Okay, Francesca, how do you consider Mazzei's propaganda for the Polish king after 1788 against the background of his American Republican experience? That's a very good question. Now, I have to say that my research on Mazzei focused more on his time in America and his early time in France. So my time frame goes to about 1791. The rest, of course, I investigated, but it's not going to be in my thesis because I had to kind of restrict the time frame. And so Mazzei had, I would say, an ambivalent position there. Well, he was close to Kosciuszko and people like that, for example. Oops, something happened there.
Oh,
were we disconnected?
Disconnected. Oh no, we weren't.
We're not
no,
disconnected.
it's fine.
We're not disconnected. The letters that Mazzei wrote to the Polish king, because Mazzei served later. What his recherche actually were useful to Mazzei for was the fact that he managed to get an employment, a diplomatic employment, but this time for Poland, for the Polish king Stanislaus Augustus Poniatowski. And he maintained a steady correspondence from France, mediating between these three spaces, that of, revolutionary France, America, and Poland, that was undergoing its own, if we might call it a revolution, although it was perhaps milder than the others. And so Mazzei kind of brokered the three. Most of the letters that Mazzei exchanged with Stanislaus Augustus actually were about France more than about America. But I think in the drafting of the Polish constitution, the debates and exchanges that Stanislaus Augustus may have had with Mazzei must have influenced the direction of that constitution, again, in terms of its enlightened moderation, I would say. So this kind of republic, enlightened republic, but with revolutionary ideals that weren't radical, but because Mazzei wasn't a radical, but more moderate. And so I think that could be expressed as a link between the two. But I don't know if I've answered the question.
You know, this is one of the core issues. And, you know, as Emily said at the very beginning, is that we say, is it a figure of speech when we say American Revolution? Or is it to be short? Or does it really mean it was a revolution? And of course, it's one of the things we'll discuss, because, by the way, is it perceived differently as a revolution in France that experienced a major one, or in Italy, or in Holland? Of course, there was the Batavian Revolution, but not as thorough as the French Revolution. So that's also one of the different questions. Is it perceived as a true revolution in every European country in the historiography? That would be interesting. Or do they simply ask the question or not? Steve?
Okay. I don't know if I can answer that question. As I say, it's too good, too big a question. But the thing that put me in mind, well, my first instinctive answer is to say, well, yes, it is. I mean, we can come up with comparative violence and comparative social change, economic change, and so on. But the fact is, 13 colonies of the British Empire, you know, this blew a great hole in the British Empire, created a new country. So there was an overthrow of an old regime. There was the creation of a new regime. I mean, what do we want? What are we going to call it if not a revolution? And secondly, it brings to mind the Becker phrase, of course, that we all know, that it wasn't just about home rule, it was also about who shall rule at home. And so there was social economic change as a result of the American Revolution. Obviously not the, you know, there wasn't the guillotining and there wasn't the overthrow of entire classes and the monarchy. Well, there was an overthrow of the monarchy, of course, in the territories that became the United States. So, you know, in all sorts of ways, I think it is perfectly reasonable to call it a revolution. And there's one other point I was going to make that I'll come back to in my paper, actually, and that's if I have time in the paper. And that is, we're on the cusp, but we're in a period where the word revolution still can contain its circular notion. That, you know, this is the rise and fall of empires. It is not necessarily about, in 18th century terms, about something radical and new. And one of the things that I'm trying to say in my paper is that that cyclical concept of history is actually contained in the Declaration, although at the same time the Declaration also contains a linear one of change for the future. So what ultimately my answer to you might be that yes, it was a revolution in every possible way you can think of. By any definition, old, new, social, political, whatever, yes, it was.
I thought everyone would agree it was a revolution, but Colin did not.
No, fair enough.
It's nice to hear your explanation. Time for the break?
Time for the break,
Okay.
and
Please,
we'll be
come back in
10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Roughly. Thank you.
Okay.